I found the scarf on a Monday evening, buried at the bottom of the laundry basket. It was red, bright, vibrant, the kind of red that practically shouted for attention. And it wasn't hers. I knew that for a fact. Haley hated red. She said it made her look washed out. She preferred muted tones, soft grays and creams that matched her minimalist aesthetic. The scarf was silk, expensive, with a faint scent of jasmine clinging to it. I held it in my hands, turning it over, the fabric sliding through my fingers like a question without an answer. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the longer I stared at it, the more uneasy I felt. I'm Jared Thompson, 35, a mechanical engineer by trade. For 10 years, I've been Haley's husband. We live in a neat little suburb outside Dallas, the kind of place where everyone's yard looks perfectly trimmed and the neighbors know just enough about you to fill their conversations. Haley works in interior design, and she's good at it, always talking about textures and flow and how spaces should feel. She makes our house look like something out of a magazine. And for the most part, our life together has been as polished as those glossy pages. But lately, something had shifted. Small things at first. She started going out more, claiming client dinners ran late. She joined a yoga class she'd never mentioned before. Her phone, once casually left on the counter, was now glued to her hand or tucked away in her purse. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was paranoid. Haley loved me. I trusted her. But the scarf was a loose thread in the fabric of our lives, and I couldn't ignore it. That night, as we sat across from each other at the dinner table, I tried to bring it up without making it obvious. I asked her how her day was, what project she was working on. She was animated, talking about some high-profile client she'd landed, her fork slicing through her salad with practiced precision. I mentioned the scarf casually, saying I'd found it while sorting the laundry. She barely missed a beat, brushing it off as something a friend had left behind during a girls' night. Her explanation was smooth, almost rehearsed. But there was a flicker in her eyes, a momentary tightness around her mouth that told me everything I needed to know. She was lying. I didn't press her. Instead, I smiled, nodded, and let the conversation flow back into safer waters. But inside, something cold settled in my chest. The scarf wasn't just a piece of fabric. It was a warning. That night, after Haley had gone to bed, I stayed up, sitting on the edge of the couch with the scarf draped across my lap. I replayed every detail of the past few months, searching for the signs I'd missed. Her late nights, the gym membership she'd signed up for in January, but barely mentioned since. The way she'd started wearing makeup to her yoga class, even though she'd always claimed she hated sweating with her face done. I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to believe her. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That maybe the woman I'd spent a decade building a life with wasn't the woman I thought she was. The scarf was just the beginning, a thread waiting to be pulled, and I was about to unravel everything. She thought I didn't see it. She thought I was blind. But Haley didn't realize I wasn't the kind of man to ignore the cracks. I was the kind of man who built things, who fixed what was broken. And if she was lying to me, if she'd betrayed me, she was about to find out just how far I'd go to set things right. The next morning, Haley was back to her usual self, poised, smiling, perfectly composed. She kissed me on the cheek as I poured my coffee, humming some unfamiliar tune as she grabbed her gym bag. She didn't mention the scarf again, and neither did I. But my mind was racing as I watched her walk out the door, the scent of her perfume lingering in the air. At work, I couldn't concentrate. The numbers and schematics in front of me blurred together, overshadowed by a single question. Was I imagining things? Haley had always been good at navigating our lives, juggling her work and our marriage with a kind of effortless grace. But now I couldn't tell if her calm demeanor was genuine or a mask hiding something I wasn't supposed to see. By lunchtime, I decided I couldn't ignore it any longer. I needed answers. That evening, while Haley was at yoga, I went to her closet. It wasn't something I'd ever done before. Rummaging through her things felt invasive wrong. But I couldn't shake the unease that had taken root in my chest. I told myself I was just looking for something, anything, that might explain the scarf. Her closet was immaculate, every item of clothing arranged by color and type. It was exactly what I'd expect from someone like Haley, who prided herself on order and aesthetics. But as I sifted through her neatly folded sweaters and carefully hung blouses, I found something that didn't belong. A pair of high heels. Black, strappy, expensive looking. They were tucked away in the corner, hidden behind a row of boots. I hadn't seen her wear them before, and Haley wasn't the type to buy things she didn't use. I pulled the shoes out, turning them over in my hands. They were pristine, as if they'd only been worn once or twice. My stomach churned as I imagined her wearing them. Not for me, but for someone else. The thought was like a punch to the gut, knocking the air out of my lungs. When Haley came home that night, I was in the kitchen pretending to read the mail. She greeted me with her usual brightness, her yoga mat slung over one shoulder. "Class was great," she said, her cheeks flushed. "I'm finally getting the hang of that new instructor's routine." I forced a smile, nodding along as she talked about her evening. But I couldn't stop staring at her, trying to read between the lines of her words, to catch the subtle shifts in her expression. She was so smooth, so polished. But now that I was looking closer, I could see the tiny cracks, the way her eyes darted away when she spoke, the tension in her shoulders when she thought I wasn't paying attention. After dinner, she went to take a shower, leaving her phone on the kitchen counter. For a moment, I stood there staring at it. The screen was locked, but I knew her password. She always used the same one, our anniversary date. My hands itched to pick it up, to scroll through her messages, her photos, her call logs. But I hesitated, the weight of what I was about to do pressing down on me like a stone. Finally, I grabbed the phone, my fingers trembling as I unlocked it. The messages were mundane at first, texts from her friends, her mom, her coworkers. But then I saw a name I didn't recognize. Nate. My heart pounded as I opened the thread, my breath catching in my throat. The messages were short, casual, but laced with a familiarity that set my teeth on edge. Him. Can't wait to see you again. Her, same. Last night was amazing. My hands shook as I scrolled further, the words blurring together as a sickening realization settled over me. This wasn't just a client or a colleague. This was someone she'd been meeting, someone she'd been lying to me about. I locked the phone and set it back on the counter, my mind racing. Haley didn't know I'd seen the messages, and I wasn't going to confront her. Not yet. I needed more than a hunch, more than a few texts. I needed proof. That night, as I lay in bed beside her, I felt the cold, hard edge of betrayal creeping in. Haley thought she was in control, that her lies were hidden, that I was too blind to see the truth. She was wrong. I wasn't just going to confront her. I was going to dismantle her lies, piece by piece, until there was nowhere left for her to hide. She thought she was clever, that she could outsmart me. But she didn't realize I was already one step ahead. This wasn't just about betrayal anymore. This was about justice. And I wasn't going to stop until I had it. The next morning, I woke up early, the weight of the previous night's discovery heavy on my chest. Haley was still asleep, her arm draped over the blanket, her face serene. It was almost laughable how peaceful she looked, as though she hadn't just torn our marriage to shreds with her lies. I left the house before she woke, claiming I needed to get to the office early. In reality, I had other plans. If Nate was the man I suspected I needed to know who he was, where he was, and how deep their connection ran. Haley had underestimated me, and I wasn't about to let her deceit go unchecked. I started with her phone. I'd installed a tracking app on it the night before, something discreet and untraceable. It would give me access to her location, texts, and calls. It was a calculated risk. If she found out, the confrontation would come sooner than I wanted. But I needed answers, and this was the fastest way to get them. By mid-morning, the app was already paying off. Haley had texted Nate again, her tone light and playful. Tonight? Same place? You know it. Can't wait. My jaw tightened as I read the exchange, my mind racing. Tonight. She was planning to see him tonight. That gave me a window, an opportunity to see it for myself. Proof. Undeniable and irrefutable. That evening, Haley told me she had another yoga class. She kissed me goodbye, her smile as bright as ever, and walked out the door with her mat slung over her shoulder. I watched her leave, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. Once she was gone, I grabbed my keys and followed her, keeping a safe distance. The tracker on her phone confirmed what I already knew. She wasn't headed to the yoga studio. Instead, she drove across town to a quiet, upscale restaurant tucked away in a neighborhood we never frequented. I parked a block away and walked the rest of the distance, my heart pounding. The restaurant was dimly lit, its windows glowing with warm light. Through the glass, I saw her sitting at a corner table, laughing and leaning forward in a way that made my stomach churn. Across from her sat Nate, a tall, well-dressed man with dark hair and an easy smile. He reached across the table, his fingers brushing against hers, and she didn't pull away. I stood there in the shadows, watching as the life I thought I had crumbled into ash. I didn't confront them. Not yet. Confrontation would be too easy, too predictable. Haley would cry, make excuses, turn it all around on me. No, I needed to wait, to buy my time, to make sure that when I did strike, there would be no room for doubt, no way for her to twist the narrative in her favor. I took out my phone and snapped a few photos through the window, each one a dagger in my chest. Her smile, his hand on hers, the intimacy that had no place in my marriage. It was all there, captured in vivid detail. Proof. When I got home, Haley was already there, sitting on the couch with her yoga mat resting by the door. She looked up as I walked in, her face lighting up in a way that made me want to scream. "Hey, how was your day?" she asked, her voice as cheerful as ever. "Fine," I said, my tone flat. "Long?" She nodded, turning her attention back to the TV. I stood there for a moment, staring at her, trying to reconcile the woman in front of me with the woman I'd seen at the restaurant. It was like looking at a stranger, someone I didn't recognize anymore. That night, as she lay asleep beside me, I pulled out my laptop and started compiling everything I'd gathered, the texts, the photos, the tracker logs. Each piece was another nail in the coffin of our marriage, another step toward the revenge she'd never see coming. Haley thought she was playing me, that I was blind to her betrayal. But she didn't realize I wasn't just watching. I was planning. She thought she was clever, that she could rewrite the rules of our marriage without consequence. She was about to learn how wrong she was. The morning after I followed Haley to the restaurant, I could barely look at her. She moved around the kitchen with her usual efficiency, pouring coffee, buttering toast, all while humming a song that grated against my nerves. She was so good at pretending, too good. But now, every movement, every word, felt like a performance designed to hide the truth. I forced myself to play along. I kissed her on the cheek when she handed me my coffee, nodded when she talked about her upcoming busy week, and smiled at all the right moments. Inside, though, I was seething. By the time I left for work, I had a plan. I spent the day poring over the evidence I'd gathered. The photos of Haley and Nate at the restaurant, the texts from the tracker app, the call logs. Each piece was damning, a clear picture of the lies she'd been feeding me for months. But I needed more. If I was going to confront her, it had to be on my terms, with no room for denial or manipulation. That afternoon, I called Patrick, my lawyer. He'd helped me draft our prenuptial agreement when Haley and I got married, and I knew he'd have my back now. I told him everything, the affair, the evidence, the plan. Patrick was calm and methodical, his voice steady as he outlined my options. "With the proof you have, this will be straightforward," he said. "You'll get the house, custody, and the financial assets you've contributed to. But if you're looking for something more, we'll need to get creative." I told him I wanted to take my time to make sure Haley understood the full weight of her choices before I pulled the trigger. Patrick agreed, offering suggestions on how to tighten my case and ensure there were no loose ends. By the time I hung up, I felt more in control than I had in weeks. That evening, Haley came home late. She didn't offer an explanation, and I didn't ask for one. Instead, I sat in the living room, pretending to watch TV while she showered and got ready for bed. Her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, and I glanced at the screen out of habit. It was a message from Nate. "Can't stop thinking about you. Last night was perfect." I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms. The audacity of it. Texting her while she was home with me, under my roof, made my blood boil. But I didn't touch the phone. I didn't need to. The tracker app had already logged the message, preserving it as another piece of evidence. The next morning, I planted the first seed of doubt. As Haley sat at the table, scrolling through her phone, I casually mentioned that I'd been thinking about taking some time off work. Maybe we should plan a trip, I said. Just the two of us. It's been a while since we've done something together. She froze for a split second, her smile faltering before she forced it back into place. That sounds nice, she said, her tone light. Let me check my schedule. I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. The hesitation in her voice, the flicker of discomfort in her eyes. It was all I needed to confirm what I already knew. She was juggling too many lies, and the cracks were starting to show. Over the next few days, I watched as Haley's carefully constructed facade began to slip. She became more distracted, more guarded, checking her phone constantly and avoiding eye contact when I asked her about her day. I didn't push her, didn't confront her. I wanted her to think she was still in control, that I was oblivious. One evening, I suggested we have dinner with some mutual friends, a couple we'd known for years. Haley hesitated, then said she wasn't feeling up to it. I went without her, and the friends asked about her absence. I kept my answer vague, letting their imaginations fill in the gaps. It was a subtle move, but it planted a question in their minds, one that would eventually come back to haunt her. By the end of the week, I had everything I needed. The evidence, the legal groundwork, the support of those closest to us. Haley thought she was playing a game, that she could balance her affair with the life we'd built together. But she didn't realize the pieces were already falling into place. The mask she wore so well was slipping, and soon it would shatter completely. I wasn't going to confront her with anger or accusations. I was going to make her face the truth on my terms, in a way she'd never see coming. Haley had written her own story of betrayal, and I was about to rewrite the ending. The following Monday, I woke up before Haley, the weight of what I was about to do pressing heavily on my chest. The plan I'd been building was intricate, precise. It wasn't about rage or vengeance. It was about control. Haley thought she could rewrite the rules of our marriage, but I was about to remind her that every story has two sides. While she slept, I logged into her laptop. I'd memorized her password long ago, a detail she'd forgotten to change. Her inbox was exactly as I expected, meticulously organized, filled with emails to clients, friends, and one particularly damning thread with Nate. I forwarded the emails to myself, carefully preserving the chain of flirtatious messages and secret plans. Then I logged out, erasing any trace of my presence. That evening, Haley announced she'd be working late again. Her voice was casual, offhand, as if she'd done nothing wrong. I nodded, playing the role of the trusting husband, and watched as she left the house, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. Once she was gone, I set the next part of my plan into motion. I called her best friend, Monica, a woman I'd always found pleasant but distant. Haley had painted her as someone who wasn't great at keeping secrets, which made her the perfect ally for what I had in mind. Monica, I said, keeping my voice calm, I need your help. I've been worried about Haley lately. She's been distant, and I think something's going on. Can we meet? There was a pause. Then Monica's voice softened. Of course, Jared. Is everything okay? I'll explain when we meet, I replied, setting a time and place. Monica didn't know it yet, but she was about to become a key piece in the game I was playing. The next day, I met Monica at a coffee shop. I brought the emails, the photos, the text messages, all the evidence I'd gathered. Her face went pale as she flipped through the pages, her hands trembling. Oh my God, she whispered. Jared, I had no idea. I nodded, keeping my expression steady. I'm not asking you to take sides, Monica. I just thought you should know the truth. She's your friend, and I thought you'd want to be prepared. Monica's eyes darted between the evidence and my face, her expression a mixture of guilt and anger. I'll talk to her, she said finally. She owes me an explanation. I thanked her and left, knowing that Haley would be blindsided when Monica confronted her. It was a small move, but it would disrupt her carefully curated facade, planting doubt in one of the few people she trusted. That evening, Haley came home tense, her movements sharp and agitated. She barely spoke during dinner, her eyes flicking to her phone every few minutes. I didn't need to ask what was wrong. Monica's confrontation had rattled her, and the cracks in her mask were starting to widen. After the boys went to bed, she sat on the couch, scrolling through her phone with a furrowed brow. I joined her, sitting in the armchair across from her, and waited for her to speak. She didn't, but the tension in the room was palpable. "Tough day?" I asked, breaking the silence. She glanced at me, her smile forced. "Just work stuff," she said, her voice tight. "Nothing major." I nodded, letting the silence stretch between us. She shifted uncomfortably, her fingers tapping against the edge of her phone. She was unraveling, and she didn't even realize it. The next morning, I received a call from Patrick, my lawyer. The divorce papers were ready, complete with the evidence I'd provided. Patrick assured me that Haley wouldn't have a leg to stand on if she tried to contest anything. The house, the financial assets, custody of the boys, it was all locked in my favor. I told him to wait before serving her. Timing was everything, and I wanted to make sure the stage was set before I made my final move. Haley's behavior grew increasingly erratic over the next few days. She started coming home later, her excuses more strained. I caught her pacing the kitchen late at night, her phone pressed to her ear, her voice low and urgent. She was losing control, and she didn't know how to stop it. She thought she was still in charge, that she could manipulate her way out of whatever she thought was happening. But she didn't realize the game was no longer hers to play. The first strike had landed, and the pieces were falling into place. Soon, she would have no choice but to face the truth. And when that moment came, I would be ready. Haley was unraveling faster than I'd anticipated. By midweek, she was snapping at the boys over small things, her usually calm demeanor replaced by a jittery edge. She stayed on her phone constantly, sending hushed texts and pacing in the backyard during calls. I could see the panic in her movements, the way she'd glance over her shoulder as though she expected the world to come crashing down at any moment. It was working. The first strike had landed, and the walls of her carefully constructed life were beginning to close in. On Thursday, I set the next piece of my plan into motion. Haley's yoga night was fast approaching, and I knew she'd use it as an excuse to meet Nate again. The tracker on her phone had given me his address, and I decided it was time to pay him a visit. After work, I drove across town to the apartment complex where Nate lived. It was a modern building, all clean lines and glass, the kind of place that screamed disposable income. I parked a block away and waited, watching as people came and went, looking for signs of him. An hour later, I saw him step out of the building, his phone pressed to his ear. He was everything I'd expected, tall, fit, and annoyingly self-assured. He wore an expensive blazer over jeans, the kind of casual elegance that Haley would have swooned over. Watching him stroll down the sidewalk, I felt a pang of anger, but I forced myself to stay calm. I wasn't here to confront him. Not yet. When I got home, Haley was already there, sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop open. She looked up as I walked in, her smile forced. "You're home early," she said, her voice tight. "Long day?" I replied, dropping my bag on the counter. "How was yours?" She hesitated, then shrugged. "Busy. You know how it is." I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. I didn't need to say anything. Her guilt was already eating away at her. The tension in the room was so thick, it felt like a physical weight pressing down on both of us. That night, I made a bold move. While Haley was in the shower, I logged into her laptop again. This time, I sent an anonymous email to Nate, attaching a selection of the photos I'd taken of him and Haley at the restaurant. The message was simple. "How much do you think your employer would like to see these?" I didn't intend to send the photos to his boss. Not yet, anyway. But I wanted him to feel the pressure, to realize that their little game wasn't as secret as they thought. The next day, I watched as the fallout began to ripple through Haley's world. She was glued to her phone during breakfast, her expression growing more frantic with each passing minute. When she thought I wasn't looking, she stepped into the other room and made a call. The tracker app recorded her conversation with Nate. He was panicking. He'd received the email and was terrified that his job and his reputation were on the line. Haley tried to calm him down, her voice tight and urgent, but it was clear she was struggling to hold it together. I sat in the living room, pretending to read the paper, listening to every word. It was a strange kind of satisfaction, knowing that the cracks in their affair were widening, that the truth was coming closer to the surface. That evening, Haley came home from work later than usual. She looked exhausted, her face pale and drawn, and I could tell she'd spent the day trying to put out fires. She barely spoke during dinner, her usual chatter replaced by a strained silence. The boys noticed, throwing me questioning looks, but I shook my head, silently telling them to let it go. After dinner, I sat across from her at the kitchen table, watching as she stared blankly at her phone. "Tough week?" I asked, my voice casual. She glanced up, startled, and nodded. "Just work stuff," she muttered. "Nothing I can't handle." I leaned back in my chair, studying her. "You seem stressed. Are you sure everything's okay?" Her eyes flicked away, her hands tightening around her phone. "I'm fine," jutted. "Really?" I nodded, letting the silence stretch between us. She was unraveling, and she didn't even realize I was the one pulling the thread. By the time Haley went to bed that night, I had the next move ready. The divorce papers, the evidence, the strategic leaks to key people in her life. It was all lined up, waiting for the moment I decided to strike. Haley thought she was holding the pieces of her life together, that she could still control the narrative. But the truth was closing in on her, and soon, she'd have no choice but to face it. The walls were closing in, and when they finally collapsed, I'd be there to watch. By the following weekend, Haley's facade was barely holding together. She avoided eye contact, her movements jittery and unfocused. Even the boys noticed, asking why Mommy seemed so tired all the time. I told them she was stressed from work, a lie she herself had used often enough. They seemed to accept it, but I could see the worry in their eyes. Haley was unraveling, and I hadn't even made my final move yet. That Saturday, she told me she had a client consultation and would be gone most of the afternoon. I nodded, smiling like the trusting husband she thought I still was. As soon as she left, I grabbed my keys and followed her. The tracker app showed her heading straight to Nate's apartment. I parked a block away, the same as before, and waited. When she didn't come out after 30 minutes, I stepped out of the car and approached the building. I wasn't going in, not yet. Instead, I taped an envelope to Nate's door. Inside was another anonymous message, along with a printout of the emails and texts I gathered between him and Haley. The note was simple. "Does she know about your wife?" I'd done my research. Nate was married, his wife a corporate lawyer who worked long hours at a downtown firm. I'd found her social media profiles, learned enough about her to know she wouldn't take kindly to discovering her husband's affair. It was a calculated risk, but I needed to rattle Nate enough to make him slip up. That evening, Haley came home later than usual. She looked tense, her smile forced, as she kissed the boys goodnight and sat down across from me in the living room. "Long day?" I asked, keeping my tone light. She nodded, her hands twisting in her lap. "Just a lot going on with this new client. They're a bit demanding." I nodded, pretending to believe her. "Want to talk about it?" She shook her head, her eyes darting away. "No, it's fine. I'll figure it out." Her voice cracked on the last word, and for a moment, I thought she might break down right there. But she held it together, standing abruptly and mumbling something about taking a shower. I watched her walk away, my chest tightening with a mixture of anger and satisfaction. She was falling apart, and I wasn't done yet. The next day, I received a call from Monica. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, as she told me she'd spoken to Haley. She denied everything, Monica said, her frustration evident. Said I was overreacting, that you were trying to manipulate me. "But something's off, Jared." I could hear it in her voice. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "I'm not asking you to take sides, Monica. I just thought you should know." She sighed. "I'll be here if you need anything." Hanging up, I felt a sense of grim satisfaction. Haley was losing her allies, her ability to control the narrative slipping through her fingers. Every move she made to patch the cracks only widened them further. By Monday, the fallout from my visit to Nate's apartment had begun. Haley spent most of the evening pacing the living room, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. I caught snippets of her conversation with Nate, her voice sharp and desperate. "I don't know who it was," she hissed. "Maybe it's someone at your office. You said your wife doesn't know, right?" I stayed in the kitchen, pretending not to hear, while inside, I felt a cold satisfaction. Nate was cracking under the pressure, and Haley was scrambling to keep their affair from imploding. That night, as she sat on the couch staring blankly at the TV, I joined her, setting a glass of wine on the coffee table. She glanced at me, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion. "You okay?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. She hesitated, then nodded. Just tired. I studied her for a moment, then leaned back in my chair. If something's wrong, you can tell me, Haley. We're supposed to be a team. Her eyes flicked to mine, and for a brief second, I thought she might confess. But then she shook her head, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I'm fine? Jaded. Really? I nodded, letting the silence stretch between us. She thought she was still in control, that she could manage the chaos I'd unleashed. But she didn't realize the collapse had already begun. The next morning, Patrick called to confirm the final details of the divorce filing. The papers would be served at the end of the week, along with the evidence packet I compiled. It was a nuclear option, one that would leave no room for negotiation or spin. Haley would have to face the truth, and there would be no escaping the consequences. She thought she could juggle her lies, that she could keep the truth buried forever. But the walls were closing in, and when they finally came crashing down, I'd be there to make sure she couldn't escape the wreckage. The collapse had begun, and soon, there would be nothing left of the life she thought she'd built. By the time Friday rolled around, Haley was hanging by a thread. She'd grown distant, her once effortless charm replaced by a quiet paranoia. She rarely made eye contact, her phone never leaving her side. The boys noticed, their questions coming more frequently. Why Mommy seemed so distracted, why she wasn't laughing with them the way she used to. I told them she was busy with work, a vague explanation they reluctantly accepted. I knew the truth would shatter them, but I also knew it had to come out. That morning, Patrick confirmed the papers had been delivered. I could only imagine Haley's reaction when she opened the envelope to find not just the divorce filing, but the mountain of evidence I'd gathered. The photos, the texts, the emails. It was all there, meticulously organized into a narrative she couldn't refute. The prenuptial agreement sealed the deal, leaving her with no leverage, no escape. I took the day off work, waiting for the inevitable explosion. It came just after noon. Haley stormed into the house, her face flushed with anger, the envelope clutched in her hand. She slammed it onto the kitchen counter, her voice shaking as she called my name. Jared, what the hell is this? I walked into the room, calm and steady, as though I'd been expecting her. I leaned against the doorway, crossing my arms as I met her furious gaze. You know exactly what it is, Haley. Her eyes darted to the envelope, then back to me. Her hands trembled as she gestured at the papers spilling out onto the counter. You went through my stuff? You spied on me? I nodded, my expression cold. I did, and what I found confirmed everything I already knew. She opened her mouth to argue, but I held up a hand to stop her. Don't. I've seen the texts, the emails, the photos. I know about Nate. I know about the lies. So don't stand there and try to deny it. Her face crumpled, and for a moment, I thought she might cry. But then her expression hardened, and she straightened her shoulders. You pushed me to this, she said, her voice venomous. You were never around, always working, always putting everything else before me. I was lonely, Jared. What did you expect? I stared at her, the weight of her words settling over me like a heavy fog. The audacity of it, the sheer gall to shift the blame onto me, was almost laughable. I expected you to honor the vows you made, I said, my voice low and steady. I expected you to come to me if something was wrong, instead of sneaking around behind my back. But clearly, I was expecting too much. Her lip trembled, but she didn't respond. She turned away, her hands gripping the edge of the counter as she stared down at the papers. I could see the wheels turning in her head, the calculations, the desperate attempts to find a way out. You can fight this, I said, breaking the silence. But it won't do you any good. The evidence is overwhelming, and the prenup ensures you walk away with nothing but your personal belongings. The house, the finances, the boys, they're staying with me. Her shoulders slumped, and she let out a shaky breath. When she turned back to face me, her expression was a mix of anger and defeat. You've been planning this for weeks, haven't you? I nodded. Months, actually, ever since I found the scarf. She blinked, her confusion evident. What scarf? The red one, I said. The one that didn't belong to you. That was the first crack, Haley. And from there, the truth unraveled. Haley left the house that afternoon, slamming the door behind her. I didn't follow her, didn't try to stop her. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the pile of papers she'd left behind. The confrontation had been ugly, but it was necessary. The life we'd built together was over, and there was no going back. That evening, I sat the boys down and told them the truth. Not all of it. They didn't need the sordid details, but enough to help them understand why things were changing. They cried, their confusion and sadness cutting me to the core. But I held them close and promised them we'd get through it together. We were stronger than this, I told them, and no matter what, we'd be okay. The next day, Haley came by to pack her things. She was quiet, subdued, her movements mechanical as she boxed up her clothes and personal belongings. She avoided my gaze, her once sharp confidence replaced by a hollow emptiness. Before she left, she stood in the doorway, her suitcase by her side. She looked at me, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. I didn't mean for it to end like this, Jared. Neither did I said, but you made your choice. She nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line. Then she turned and walked out, leaving the house and our marriage behind. The days after Haley left were a blur of adjustments and quiet reflection. The boys and I settled into a new routine, one that felt strange at first but quickly became our normal. Without Haley's presence, the house felt different. Not empty, but lighter, as though a weight had been lifted. I didn't miss the tension, the late nights of suspicion, the feeling of walking on eggshells. What I missed was the idea of what we'd had, the life I thought we were building together. The boys were resilient, stronger than I'd given them credit for. Maddox, my oldest, threw himself into soccer, his afternoons spent on the field with his teammates. Noah, my youngest, took to the workshop with me, his curiosity about tools and building filling the void left by Haley's absence. I focused on them, on their happiness, on creating a stable, loving home where they could thrive. Haley, true to form, tried to spin the narrative. Word spread quickly through our circle of friends about the divorce, and her version of events painted her as the victim of an overworked, inattentive husband. I didn't bother to correct her. The truth had a way of surfacing, and I knew it was only a matter of time before people saw her for who she really was. The evidence I'd gathered, emails, texts, photos, had been quietly shared with the right people. I wasn't interested in humiliation, but I wasn't going to let her rewrite history either. Friends who had initially sided with her began to drift back, their apologies awkward but sincere. I accepted them, but I didn't dwell on the past. My focus was on moving forward. One afternoon, while cleaning out the garage, I came across a box of old photos and keepsakes from our marriage. At the top was our wedding album, its white leather cover, slightly worn from years of handling. I opened it, flipping through the pages of smiling faces, hopeful vows, and promises of forever. Looking at those photos, I felt a strange mix of emotions: nostalgia, regret, and, surprisingly, relief. The man in those pictures had been happy, yes, but also blind. He believed in a version of Haley that didn't exist, in a marriage that had cracks long before the betrayal. I closed the album and set it aside, ready to let go of the weight it carried. The business became my sanctuary. I poured my energy into it, expanding the workshop, taking on new projects, and finding fulfillment in the tangible results of my work. Noah became my little apprentice, his enthusiasm for building infectious. Together, we created furniture that wasn't just functional, but meaningful, a testament to resilience and renewal. Maddox, meanwhile, started designing furniture of his own, sketching out ideas on scrap paper and proudly showing them to me. One day, he handed me a drawing of a table, its design intricate and unique. "We should build this," he said, his eyes shining with excitement. I smiled, ruffling his hair. "Let's do it." Months passed, and the boys and I found our rhythm. The house was filled with laughter again, the scars of Haley's betrayal fading into the background. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't bitter. I'd made my peace with what had happened, and in the process, I'd found a strength I didn't know I had. Haley tried to reach out once, a brief email filled with apologies and vague promises of change. I read it, felt nothing, and deleted it without replying. There was nothing left to say. One evening, As the boys and I sat around the dinner table, Noah looked up at me, his expression serious. "Are we going to be okay, Dad?" he asked, his voice small. I reached across the table, taking his hand in mine. "We already are, buddy," I said. "We already are." Maddox nodded, a small smile playing at his lips. "Yeah, we are." Looking at them, I felt an overwhelming sense of pride and gratitude. Haley's betrayal had been a turning point, but it hadn't defined us. We'd rebuilt stronger and closer than ever. The pieces had been picked up, and together we were moving forward. We weren't just surviving. We were thriving. The years following Haley's departure were a testament to resilience. Not just mine, but Maddox and Noah's as well. They grew into remarkable young men, shaped not by the fracture of our family, but by the strength we found in its rebuilding. The echoes of betrayal became background noise, distant and irrelevant as we built something stronger. Maddox's table design turned out to be a hit. We spent weeks working on it together in the workshop, tweaking the dimensions, sanding the edges until they were smooth as silk. When it was finished, we displayed it in the showroom, a centerpiece of our expanding business. A local artisan market featured it in their gallery, and it sold within hours, launching Maddox's first taste of creative success. Noah, meanwhile, continued to thrive in the workshop. His curiosity and natural aptitude for engineering blossomed into a passion for design and mechanics. By the time he reached high school, he was building pieces independently, creating furniture that combined function with innovative ideas. Carter and Sons became more than a business. It became a legacy. We opened a second location in a neighboring city, followed by an online store that brought in orders from across the country. Our story, of a father and his sons building a life together after heartbreak, resonated with people in ways I hadn't anticipated. Customers didn't just buy our furniture. They connected with our journey. Maddox's designs began gaining national attention, leading to collaborations with other artisans and features in design magazines. Noah started working on a modular furniture line, blending his engineering skills with a creative flair. Watching them thrive filled me with a pride that no words could capture. Haley remained a distant memory, her presence reduced to an occasional whisper from the past. She reached out sporadically. Her attempts to reconnect with the boys met with polite indifference from Maddox and silence from Noah. They had made their peace with her absence, and so had I. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she had moved to another state, trying to start fresh. I bore her no ill will. The anger and resentment had long since faded. She was a chapter we'd read and closed. One evening, as the three of us sat on the porch watching the sunset, Maddox turned to me, his expression thoughtful. "You know, Dad, if you hadn't been so strong after everything, I don't think we'd be here. The business, the house, us, it's all because of you." I smiled, shaking my head. "No, Maddox, it's because of us. We built this together." Noah grinned, raising his glass of lemonade in a mock toast. "To Carter and Sons, and the best dad ever." We laughed, clinking our glasses together, the sound ringing out into the cool evening air. It was a simple moment, but it encapsulated everything we'd worked for: love, resilience, and the unshakable bond we'd forged through the hardest of times. As the years went on, Carter and Sons continued to grow, a living testament to the strength of family and the power of starting over. The boys carved out their own paths, building on the foundation we'd created together. And I, in turn, found peace in the life we'd built. Haley's betrayal had once threatened to destroy us, but in the end, it had done the opposite. It had forced us to grow, to fight, to create something better. It had shown me the depths of my own strength and the boundless potential of my sons. We hadn't just survived, we had thrived. And as I looked out at the horizon, the stars beginning to peek through the fading light, I knew one thing for certain. We were exactly where we were meant to be. Together, we had built a life that no one could tear down. A life worth living. A legacy worth leaving behind. What are your thoughts on my story? Let me know in the comments what you think about my choice and how you might have dealt with it.